Millionaire came home early and was shocked by what he saw. Richard Anderson decided to cancel his last-minute meeting to come home early and surprise Margaret on her 60th birthday. After 35 years of marriage, he knew she wasn't expecting anything special, especially since he always prioritized business over any celebration. But what he saw when he quietly walked through the front door of their Beverly Hills mansion left him completely frozen. A young woman dressed in dirty clothes with messy hair was sitting on his imported leather couch, feeding a baby with a bottle. The most disturbing part was that the child was wearing a blue onesie with gold embroidery, one he recognized immediately. "Who are you? How did you get into my house?" Richard managed to ask, still processing the surreal scene. The woman looked up, frightened. She couldn't have been more than 30, but her face bore the marks of someone who had faced many hardships. "Please don't call anyone," she whispered, instinctively shielding the baby. "I just needed to feed my son. It's so cold outside." Richard felt something strange stir in his chest. After decades of building his business empire, he had developed a coldness that shielded him from emotional weakness. But there was something about this scene that touched him inexplicably. "Mr. Anderson," the voice of Dorothy, the housekeeper, echoed down the hallway. "I can explain everything." The woman in her 60s came running, her hands nervously clutching her apron. "Dorothy, what is the meaning of this?" Richard kept his voice controlled, but his tone was icy. "She showed up at the back door, sir. It was raining, the baby wouldn't stop crying. I couldn't leave them out there. I thought I could give the child some milk before—" The sound of heels clicking down the stairs interrupted her explanation. Margaret appeared at the top of the staircase, flawless as always, in her beige dress and perfectly styled hair. When her eyes landed on the scene in the living room, her face went completely pale. "Richard, who is this woman?" Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, back to the story. Margaret descended the steps slowly, each movement deliberate. Richard knew that expression. It was the same one she wore when something deeply upset her, but she was trying to stay composed. "Margaret, I just got home and found this. Dorothy says she came asking for help. Get this person out of here immediately." Margaret's voice was louder than usual. "How dare you come into our home?" The woman shrank back on the couch, but didn't let go of the baby. Richard noticed her staring intently at the wall behind him, where a large family portrait from years ago hung. In the photo, he, Margaret, and their son Brian smiled stiffly for the camera. "Wait," Richard raised a hand. "Let's talk calmly. What's your name?" "Jennifer," she answered softly. "Jennifer Miller." The name meant nothing to him, but Richard noticed Margaret took a small step back when she heard it. "And the baby?" "My son, Ethan. He's 6 months old." Richard studied the child more closely. The blue onesie with gold embroidery was from an extremely expensive brand, one he had personally bought 2 years ago. He had stored it in the guest room drawer, along with other gifts he'd bought for the day he'd finally meet a grandchild. Brian had been living in Chicago for 4 years and had never mentioned plans for children. "Dorothy, where did you find this outfit for the baby?" The housekeeper hesitated, glancing quickly at Margaret. I thought the baby was cold, sir. I got it from the back room, where the stored things are." Richard felt a pang of suspicion. Dorothy had worked with them for 15 years and knew the house better than anyone. She knew exactly where everything was and would never take anything without asking. "Margaret, did you know we had these baby clothes stored away?" His wife avoided his gaze. You bought so many things over the years. I can't remember all of them." Richard moved closer to Jennifer. There was something familiar about the way she held the baby, the way she hummed softly to soothe him. Ethan had stopped crying and now looked around curiously with big dark eyes. "Jennifer, why did you come specifically to this house? Beverly Hills is far from downtown." She hesitated, glancing again at the portrait on the wall. "Someone told me that I might find help here." "Who told you that?" "I can't say." Margaret stepped forward abruptly. Richard, enough of this. This woman is obviously lying. I'll call the security to escort her out. No, Richard said firmly. Dorothy, prepare the guest room on the ground floor. Jennifer and the baby will stay here tonight. Richard, Margaret protested. Have you lost your mind? We don't know this woman. That's exactly why she's staying, until I figure out what's going on here. Margaret's face twisted into an expression Richard hadn't seen in years. Fear, genuine fear. Jennifer tried to protest, saying she didn't want to cause trouble, but Richard wouldn't budge. Something about this whole situation didn't add up, and he hadn't gotten where he was by ignoring his instincts. During dinner, served in silence by a visibly nervous Dorothy, Richard watched Jennifer eat as if she hadn't seen food in days. Ethan slept in her arms, wrapped in a blanket Dorothy had found. The housekeeper seemed to be avoiding Margaret's gaze at all costs. Jennifer, you said someone guided you here. Does this person know our family? She chewed slowly before answering. She said you might help me because you have good hearts. Richard nearly choked. Good hearts? He was known in the business world for his calculated coldness. He'd laid off hundreds without blinking, closed deals that ruined small businesses. Good hearts were the last thing anyone would say about Richard Anderson. Who told you that? Margaret asked, trying to sound casual. A woman I met at the city shelter. She volunteers there. Richard saw Margaret swallow hard. This woman, did she give you our address? Not exactly. She mentioned the neighborhood, described the house, said it was the Anderson family, that the husband ran a big company and the wife always helped people in need. Richard looked at Margaret in surprise. His wife did volunteer work. In 15 years of marriage, he'd never heard of this. Margaret, you never told me about this volunteer work. I sometimes help at the city shelter. It's nothing major. Jennifer looked up from her plate. The woman who helped me is well known there. Mrs. Eleanor. She's been going there every week for years. Richard saw Margaret's face turn paper white. Eleanor was his mother's name, and she had passed away 5 years ago. His mother had indeed volunteered, but Richard never knew Margaret had kept up any related activities. Eleanor, Richard murmured. My mother's name was Eleanor. Jennifer looked at him with renewed interest. The Mrs. Eleanor who helped me was in her 70s. White hair, always wore a butterfly brooch on her coat. She talked a lot about her family, especially a grandson who lived far away. Richard's heart raced. The butterfly brooch had been the anniversary gift he'd given his mother years ago. She wore it every day. When was the last time you saw this Eleanor? About 2 months ago. She stopped showing up at the city shelter. The other volunteers said she was sick. Richard felt a lump in his throat. His mother had passed away 5 years ago, but apparently someone had been using her identity at the shelter, and this person knew intimate details about the Anderson family. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, back to the story. After dinner, Richard locked himself in his office to process everything that had happened. He picked up the phone and called Brian in Chicago. It was late, but his son always answered his father's calls. Dad, is something wrong? Brian, I need to ask you a direct question. Do you know someone named Jennifer Miller? The silence on the other end lasted far too long. Dad, why are you asking that? Answer my question, Brian. Where did you hear that name? Richard's stomach dropped. The hesitation in his son's voice confirmed his suspicions. She's at our house, Brian, with a 6-month-old baby. The sound that came through the phone was like a muffled sob. Dad, I can explain. I'll take the first flight to New York. Brian, this baby. He's my son, Dad. Ethan is my son. Richard closed his eyes. At 55, he had just discovered he was a grandfather, and he'd found out in the worst possible way. Why didn't you ever tell me? Because Mom said Jennifer had run away, that she wanted nothing to do with me, that she'd taken money to disappear. I looked for her for months, but your mother lied to you. What? Jennifer is here, Brian, in terrible condition, living on the streets with your son. The phone went silent for a long moment. I'll be there tomorrow morning, Dad. Please don't let her leave." When Richard hung up, his hands were shaking. He sat in his office's leather armchair, the same chair where he'd made decisions worth millions, and for the first time in decades, he felt completely lost. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. It was Dorothy. "May I come in, sir?" "Of course, Dorothy." The housekeeper entered, closed the door behind her, and stood nervously. "Mr. Richard, I need to tell you something. I can't carry this burden any longer." Richard studied her. Dorothy had helped raise Brian alongside them. She was practically family. "What do you need to say?" "It's about the young woman, sir. Jennifer. She didn't show up here by accident today." "Go on." "Mrs. Margaret asked me to look for her. We've been trying to find her for weeks." Richard leaned forward. "Why?" "Because of your mother's will, sir. Mrs. Eleanor left part of the inheritance to her first great-grandchild, but only if the child was recognized by the family." Richard felt the world spin. His mother had died 5 years ago and left behind a considerable fortune. He'd received most of it, but he'd always found it odd that a small amount had been placed in a trust with specific conditions. Conditions the lawyer said he'd understand when the time came. "Dorothy, how did Margaret know about Jennifer and the baby?" The housekeeper hesitated. "Mrs. Margaret received a letter, sir, from someone who claimed to be the girl's friend. It said she had your grandchild and was in dire need." "And why didn't you tell me?" "Mrs. Margaret said she'd handle it herself, that she didn't want to trouble you with this kind of problem." Richard stood abruptly. "What kind of problem, Dorothy?" "She thought the girl might be lying, trying to take advantage of the family. She said she'd verify the story before involving you." "And what did you find out?" "The girl really is who she claims to be, sir." Dorothy lowered her voice. "And the baby has the Anderson birthmark." Richard instinctively touched his neck, where he had a small crescent-shaped mark. His father had it, he had it, Brian had it. "Did Margaret see the mark?" "Yes, sir. That's when she told me to find the girl and bring her here." "But why wasn't I told?" Dorothy looked at the floor. "Mrs. Margaret said she wanted to give you good news on her birthday, that it would be a surprise for you to meet your grandson." Richard felt something didn't add up in this story. Knowing Margaret, she would never risk a surprise she couldn't control. "Dorothy, where did you find Jennifer?" "She was at a city shelter downtown, but before that she spent months living on the streets." "Why was she on the streets?" "She said when the baby was born, she came looking for the family, but someone told her you wanted nothing to do with her and that if she kept insisting, they'd make her regret it." Richard felt his blood boil. "Who told her that?" "She wouldn't say, sir. But she was terrified. Said the person knew where she lived, where she worked." Richard stormed out of the office like a hurricane. He found Margaret in the living room, still in her party dress, pretending to read a magazine. "Margaret, we need to talk. Now." She looked up, trying to seem casual. "About what, dear?" "About the fact that I just found out I'm a grandfather, and about the fact that you've known for weeks." Margaret's face hardened. "Richard, I can explain." "Then explain." "Explain why my grandson spent the first 6 months of his life on the streets, while you pretended nothing was happening." "I was protecting our family." "Protecting us from what? From a girl who just wanted us to acknowledge our own blood?" Margaret stood up, all composure gone. "You don't understand. This woman showed up out of nowhere claiming to have Brian's child. How was I supposed to know it was true? By doing a DNA test, by talking to me, by being honest. And if it was a lie, if she was a con artist, you'd want our name dragged into a scandal like that." Richard stared at her as if seeing a stranger. "Margaret, we're talking about a child who could be my grandson." "Could be, you don't know for sure." "I do. I spoke to Brian. He confirmed everything." Margaret paled again. "You called Brian?" "I did. And you know what he told me? That you said Jennifer had run off with money, that she wanted nothing to do with our family." I was trying to protect my son." "By lying to him? By keeping him from his own child?" Margaret collapsed into the armchair, her facade crumbling. Richard, you don't understand. That girl isn't from our social class. She would have ruined Brian's plans, destroyed his future. What plans, Margaret? Our son has been depressed for years, living alone on the other side of the world with no purpose in life. He's building an international career. He's running away. And now I know from what. Richard stepped back, filled with anger and disgust. You made a mother and child live on the streets to protect our reputation. I offered her money, a lot of money. She could have gone anywhere, started a new life far from here. And did she take the money? Margaret hesitated. She said she only wanted the family to acknowledge the child, that she wasn't interested in money. And you still pushed her away. I said we'd think about it, that we needed time. And then I had some people talk to her, to explain it would be better for everyone if she didn't insist on this. Richard felt a chill. What people, Margaret? People who work for the company, people who know how to handle delicate situations. You had a mother with a newborn baby intimidated? I was protecting our family. Protecting you? Richard stepped further away from her. You were protecting yourself, your reputation, your social standing. Richard, please try to understand. Understand what? That you ruined an innocent girl's life? That you lied to our son? That you hid my grandson's existence from me? Margaret began to cry, but they were tears of self-pity, not remorse. I just wanted our life to stay the way it always was. Peaceful, organized, uncomplicated. Our life was never peaceful, Margaret. It was empty, and now I understand why. Richard left the room, leaving Margaret alone with her tears. He climbed the stairs quietly and went to the guest room where Jennifer was staying. He knocked lightly on the door. Jennifer, may I come in? Of course. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, with Ethan in her arms. The baby was fast asleep, his little face serene. How are you feeling? Better. Thank you for letting us stay here. It's been a while since Ethan slept in a real bed. Richard sat in a nearby armchair. Jennifer, I need to apologize to you, on behalf of my family. She looked at him in surprise. Apologize for what? For the way you were treated, for everything you've been through these months. Jennifer lowered her eyes. You didn't know anything, did you? No, but that doesn't excuse me. I should have known. I should have been there when you needed me. You have a very handsome grandson, she said softly. Richard's chest tightened. He looked at the baby, truly seeing him for the first time. Ethan had the dark eyes of the family, the square jaw all the Anderson men shared. He was undeniably his blood. May I hold him? Jennifer hesitated for just a second before handing Ethan to him. Richard cradled his grandson carefully, as if holding something precious and fragile. The baby opened his eyes, blinked a few times, then looked straight at Richard. For a moment that felt eternal, grandfather and grandson stared at each other in silence. Hi, Ethan, Richard whispered. I'm your grandfather. The baby gave what seemed like a smile, and Richard felt his world shift completely. All the meetings, all the business deals, all the numbers that had seemed so important suddenly paled in comparison to that innocent gaze. Jennifer, tell me how you got here. And she did. She told him about meeting Brian when she worked as a nurse at Mercy Private Hospital, where he was being treated for depression, how they slowly fell in love, with him always coming back to see her even after his discharge, how they planned a future together, how she got pregnant, and how Brian had been overjoyed at the news. She told him about the day men in suits showed up at the hospital where she worked and said the Anderson family had no interest in her or the baby, how they knew intimate details of her life, where she lived, where she studied, her parents' names, how they said if she kept bothering the family, they'd make sure she never worked at any hospital in New York City again. She told him how she tried calling Brian, but his number had been changed, how she went to Richard's company, but was stopped at reception, how she wrote letters that were never answered. She told him about the last months of her pregnancy, working odd jobs to save money, how Ethan was born at City General Maternity Ward during a shift when she was alone because she had no one to call family, She told him about the first months trying to care for the baby while job hunting, getting rejected everywhere, always with the excuse that there were no openings, though she suspected someone was sabotaging her efforts. She told him how the money ran out, how they were evicted from the small apartment they rented, how they spent weeks living on the streets until they found a spot at the city shelter. Richard listened silently, holding Ethan in his arms, feeling anger grow inside him with every word. When she finished, he had to take several deep breaths before he could speak. "Jennifer, you'll stay here with us, you and Ethan, for as long as you need." "I can't accept. We've already caused enough trouble." "You haven't caused any trouble. The problems were already there. You just brought them to light." Jennifer looked at him with gratitude and suspicion mixed in her eyes. "And your wife? She won't want us here." "Margaret will have to accept it. This is my home too, and Ethan is my grandson." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps those of us just starting out. Now, continuing. The next morning, Richard woke before dawn. He'd slept little, his mind racing with everything he'd learned. He went down to the kitchen and found Dorothy preparing breakfast. "Good morning, sir. Are you all right?" "I'm trying to understand how things got to this point, Dorothy." The housekeeper lowered her eyes. "Sir, there's something else I need to tell you." Richard poured himself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen counter. "What else?" "It's about Mrs. Eleanor, your mother." "My mother? She passed away 5 years ago, Dorothy." "I know, sir, but..." "Mrs. Eleanor knew Jennifer." Richard nearly dropped his cup. "What do you mean?" "Before she passed, Mrs. Eleanor found out about the baby. Jennifer had gone to her during her volunteer work, trying to get help when no one in the family would listen. My mother knew I was going to be a grandfather." "Yes, sir, and she was so happy. She said she'd finally have a great-granddaughter to spoil." "Great-granddaughter?" "Mrs. Eleanor thought the baby would be a girl. She'd even prepared a little room in her house, bought clothes, toys." Richard felt his chest tighten. His mother had died dreaming of a great-grandchild she never got to meet. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" Mrs. Margaret asked everyone to keep quiet, said Mrs. Eleanor was delirious from her medication, that we shouldn't encourage false hopes. "And you believed that?" "I didn't know what to think, sir." Mrs. Eleanor seemed so clear-headed when she spoke about the baby, but Mrs. Margaret said it was best not to feed false hopes. Richard stood and began pacing the kitchen. "Dorothy, did my mother leave anything for the baby, beyond what was in the will?" "Yes, sir. It's all stored in her little room in the house where she lived. Mrs. Margaret said she'd arranged to donate everything to charity." "Take me there today." "Sir, I want to see what my mother prepared for Ethan." An hour later, Richard stood in the house where his mother had spent her final years. She'd refused to move into the mansion, preferring her modest home in Westchester. Dorothy opened the door to what had once been a study, and Richard found himself facing a sight that nearly brought him to tears. The room was decorated in pastel tones, with a wooden crib at the center, a nursing chair by the window, and shelves filled with children's books, educational toys, and baby clothes carefully organized by size. On the wall, his mother had hung a family tree of the Andersons, with a blank space left intentionally for the baby's photo. On the dresser, a photo album already started, its first pages filled with pictures of Jennifer's pregnancy. Someone had given them to Eleanor. On the last used page, a photo of Jennifer smiling, her belly clearly visible, with a handwritten dedication, "To Grandma Eleanor, with love, Jennifer and baby Anderson." "My mother really knew Jennifer," Richard murmured. "She knew and adored her, sir. Mrs. Eleanor used to say the young woman had a heart of gold, that she was exactly the kind of person our family needed." Richard opened the album and saw photos he had never seen before. Jennifer and Brian together, smiling, clearly in love. Jennifer showing the ultrasound to Eleanor, Eleanor knitting a blue blanket while Jennifer organized baby clothes. When were these photos taken? "In the last months of Mrs. Eleanor's life, sir. Jennifer came here almost every weekend. Mrs. Eleanor was teaching her family recipes, preparing her to be a true Anderson." Richard felt a wave of emotion so strong he had to lean against the wall. Why did no one tell me any of this? Mrs. Margaret forbade it, sir. She said Mrs. Eleanor was confused because of her age, that it wasn't good to encourage her fantasies. And you believed that? Sir, Mrs. Margaret is very convincing when she wants to be, and Mrs. Eleanor really was frail in her last months. We thought maybe what, Dorothy? Maybe she was making up this story to feel less alone. Richard opened a drawer in the dresser and found letters written in his mother's own hand. Letters for Ethan to be given to him when he grew up. Letters about the family, about traditions, about the love she already felt for him. In one of the letters she wrote, "My dear great-grandson, I know I may no longer be here when you arrive, but I want you to know you were loved long before you were born. Your mother is a wonderful young woman, and I'm certain she'll raise you to be an honorable man like your father and grandfather. I hope one day you'll understand that sometimes adults make mistakes out of fear, but love always finds a way to set things right." Richard had to stop reading. Tears blurred his vision. Dorothy, why didn't my mother come to me directly about this? She tried, sir, many times. But Mrs. Margaret always intercepted the calls, said you were too busy to talk about these fantasies. And you saw my mother trying to reach me? Yes, sir. Once she even came to the mansion, but Mrs. Margaret said you didn't want to be disturbed. Richard closed his eyes. How many important things had he missed because of the barrier Margaret built around him? How many chances to be present in the lives of those who mattered? Sir, there's one more thing. Richard opened his eyes. What? Mrs. Eleanor left a letter for you. It's in her safe. Dorothy opened a small safe in the closet and took out a sealed envelope with Humaisi. For my son Richard, written in his mother's elegant handwriting. Richard opened the letter with trembling hands. My dear son, if you're reading this, you've finally learned about Ethan and Jennifer. I know you must be confused and maybe even angry, but I ask you to hear me out. Jennifer is an exceptional young woman. In all the months I knew her, I saw in her the kindness, intelligence, and strength I always wanted in a daughter-in-law. She loves Brian deeply, and I know she'll be a wonderful mother to Ethan. I also know Margaret doesn't approve of this union. She came to me many times trying to convince me Jennifer wasn't right for our family. But son, you mustn't let pride and prejudice destroy your son's chance at happiness. Ethan will be born with or without the family's approval. The only choice we have is whether he grows up knowing he's loved by all of us, or feeling unwelcome. I choose love. I've always chosen love. And I hope you will too. Take care of Jennifer. Take care of Ethan. They are our family now. With all my love, Mom. Richard finished reading the letter and remained silent for a long time. He finally understood that his mother had tried to protect Jennifer and Ethan the best way she could, even knowing she might not live to see her great-grandson grow up. Dorothy, I need to take all these things home. Ethan needs to see the little room his great-grandmother prepared for him. I'll arrange everything, sir. On the way home, Richard stopped at a toy store and bought a musical mobile with colorful animals. There was a strange urgency in his chest, as if he needed to make up for all the lost months. When he arrived, he found Jennifer in the garden, sitting on a bench under the shade of a cherry tree, with Ethan in her arms. The baby was awake, curiously watching the leaves swaying in the breeze. Good afternoon, Jennifer. Good afternoon, Mr. Anderson. Richard sat beside her on the bench. Just Richard is fine, after all, we're family. Jennifer smiled timidly. How are you feeling today? Better. Ethan slept through the night. It's been months since he slept so well. And you? Me too, thank you for everything. Richard watched his grandson trying to grab a fallen leaf nearby. Jennifer, I need to tell you some things about my mother. And Richard told her everything. About the prepared room, the letters, how Eleanor had loved Ethan even before he was born. Jennifer cried when she learned that Grandma Eleanor had passed away without meeting Ethan in person. She talked about you so much, Jennifer said. She said you were a good man but had lost your way a little. That you needed to remember what truly mattered. She was right, I did lose my way. She also said that once you met Ethan, everything would change. And it did. In less than 24 hours, my whole life changed. Ethan began to fuss, and Jennifer lifted him up, supporting him so he could look around better. The baby made happy little sounds. "He's trying to talk to you," Jennifer said with a smile. Richard held out his finger, which Ethan immediately grabbed with his tiny hand. "Hi, Ethan. Grandpa's here." The baby let out a giggle, the first truly joyful sound Richard had heard him make. "Jennifer, Brian arrives tonight. You two need to talk." Jennifer's expression tightened slightly. "I know, but I don't know what to say to him. So much time has passed." "Tell the truth. To each other. Brian suffered these past months too. He looked for you but was deceived like the rest of us. What if he doesn't want anything to do with me? What if he only wants to meet Ethan?" Richard looked at her tenderly. "Jennifer, my son spent the last 2 years depressed and lost. When I spoke about you yesterday, I heard a liveliness in his voice I hadn't heard in years. You'll figure this out." At that moment, Margaret appeared on the porch. She had spent the day locked in her room, avoiding any confrontation. "Richard, can I speak with you?" Richard stood. "Jennifer, I'll handle this now. Don't worry." He walked to where Margaret was waiting. "Did you talk to Brian?" she asked. "I did. He arrives at 10 tonight. Richard, I know you're angry with me, but you have to understand I did everything thinking I was protecting our family." "Margaret, I won't argue about this now. What's done is done. Now we need to think about the future." "What future?" "The future where Ethan grows up knowing he's loved by his whole family. The future where Jennifer feels welcome in our home. The future where Brian can be happy." "And me, what's my place in that future?" Richard looked her in the eyes. "That depends on you, Margaret. You can choose to be part of this family for real, or you can keep trying to control everything and lose it." "Richard, Margaret, I don't want apologies anymore. I want actions. Jennifer and Ethan can stay here as long as they need. If that bothers you, maybe you should consider spending a few days at the beach house to think about what really matters." Margaret fell silent for a moment. "Are you asking me to leave?" "I'm asking you to decide who you want to be from now on. The woman who pushes away a daughter-in-law and a grandson out of pride, or the woman who helps build a real family?" Richard walked back to the garden, leaving Margaret alone with her thoughts. That evening, New York City's airport was as busy as ever. Richard waited in the arrivals area, more nervous than he'd felt in years. Jennifer had stayed home with Ethan, still not ready for the reunion. When Brian appeared at the passenger exit, Richard barely recognized him. His son was thinner, with deep shadows under his eyes, and the look of someone who had suffered greatly. "Dad. Brian." They embraced, and Richard felt how shaken his son was. "How are they? Jennifer and Ethan?" "They're fine. Ethan is beautiful, Brian. Just like you when you were a baby." "Dad, I need to explain." "You don't have to explain anything now. Let's go home. Your family is waiting for you." In the car, Brian told his version of the story. How he met Jennifer at the hospital, how he fell for her kindness and intelligence, how they planned a future together, how overjoyed he was when she got pregnant. He spoke of the day his mother showed up in Chicago with the story that Jennifer had taken money to disappear, how he didn't believe it at first, but the evidence Margaret presented seemed convincing. He told of the months spent searching for Jennifer, hiring private investigators, trying to find any trace of her. How he slowly lost hope, sinking into a depression that nearly destroyed him. "Dad, I never stopped loving her. Not for a single day." "I know, son. And she never stopped loving you either." When they arrived home, Richard led Brian straight to the guest room. Jennifer was sitting in an armchair, nursing Ethan. When she saw Brian, her eyes filled with tears. "Jennifer." "Hi, Brian." Richard quietly stepped out, closing the door behind him. Some moments needed to be private. Outside, he heard soft voices, then crying. First hers, then his, then both together. He heard Ethan start to cry and then stop. He heard quiet laughter, words of love, promises never to be apart again. 2 hours later, Brian came out of the room, holding Ethan in his arms, with Jennifer by his side. The three of them looked like a complete family. "Dad, I want to officially introduce you. This is Ethan, your grandson." Richard took the baby in his arms and felt that wave of unconditional love all over again. "Hi, Ethan. Now that your daddy's here, our family is whole." Ethan looked at him and, for the first time, gave a real smile, a toothless grin that lit up his little face. "Dad, Jennifer told me everything that happened, how you took care of them, how you found out the truth." "Brian, I'm so sorry it took me so long to know about you." "You couldn't have known," Jennifer interjected. "We should have tried harder." "No, Jennifer, you did everything right. The fault was with this family. But now we'll make it right." Brian looked around. "Where's Mom?" "In her room, still processing everything." "Dad, I need to talk to her." "Are you sure?" "Yes, she's my mother, and Ethan is her grandson too. We need to resolve this as a family." Richard admired his son's maturity. At 32, Brian was finally acting like a grown man, taking responsibility not just for his own happiness, but for the family's harmony. "Jennifer, are you comfortable with this conversation?" "Yes. I think it's necessary too." Half an hour later, the family was gathered in the living room. Margaret had come downstairs, still visibly shaken, but trying to maintain her composure. Ethan slept in Jennifer's arms, oblivious to the tension in the room. "Mom," Brian began, "I need you to look at your grandson." Margaret looked at Ethan, and Richard saw something shift in her expression. It was impossible to look at that baby and not fall in love. "He's beautiful," she murmured. "He's your grandson, Mom, and Jennifer is my family. We're getting married." Margaret's eyes snapped up. "Brian." "No, Mom, let me speak. These 2 years away from Jennifer were the worst of my life. I was slowly dying without understanding why. Now I know. It was because half my heart was with her. Son, I know you think you love her, but I don't think I love her. I do, and Ethan is my son, our blood. Look at him, Mom. Really look." Margaret stepped closer and studied Ethan more carefully. The baby opened his eyes and gazed back at her curiously. Can I hold him?" Jennifer hesitated only a second before handing Ethan to Margaret. The baby settled into his grandmother's arms as if he'd known her for years. "Hi, Ethan," Margaret whispered. "I'm your Grandma Margaret." Ethan let out a content little sound and nestled deeper into her embrace. "Mom," Brian continued, "I know you wanted to protect our family, but you almost destroyed it. Ethan spent 6 months without knowing his family because of your choices." Margaret lowered her eyes. "I know. I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Afraid you wouldn't be accepted by society. Afraid it would hurt your career. Afraid I'd be happy in a way you didn't approve of," Brian finished. "That's not true." "It is, Mom. You've always wanted to control everything in my life, where I'd study, what career I'd pursue, who I'd be with. But this time, you went too far." Jennifer, who had stayed quiet, finally spoke. "Mrs. Anderson, I understand your concern. I really don't come from a wealthy family like yours. My parents are factory workers. I grew up in a modest home. But I love Brian, and I'll love and care for Ethan with all my strength." "Jennifer, Margaret started but couldn't finish. "Mom," Richard intervened, "you have a choice to make. You can keep trying to control our lives and lose your family, or you can accept that love is more important than any social differences." Margaret looked down at Ethan, who had fallen asleep in her arms. When she lifted her gaze, there were tears in her eyes. "I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose him." "Then stop trying to push us apart," Brian said. "Jennifer," Margaret turned to her daughter-in-law, "can you forgive me?" "Mrs. Anderson, I don't hold grudges. I just want Ethan to grow up in a united family." Margaret nodded, still cradling Ethan. "Then let's start over. All of us." Richard felt an immense relief wash over him. Finally, his family was whole. In the days that followed, the house transformed. Brian cancelled his apartment in Chicago and moved back to the US permanently. Jennifer and Ethan settled into the room that had once been Brian's alone, now shared by the couple. Richard arranged for all the belongings his mother had prepared for Ethan to be brought over. The crib was set up beside the couple's bed, and the room filled with the toys and tiny clothes Eleanor had so lovingly chosen. Surprisingly, Margaret began taking a genuine interest in Ethan. She spent hours holding him, chatting about everything and nothing, as if making up for lost time. "Richard," she said one morning while feeding Ethan his bottle, "I think your mother was right about Jennifer." "How so?" "She really is special. Yesterday she helped me figure out how to change his diaper, even after everything I did to her. She didn't hold any resentment." Richard smiled. Your mother had always been a good judge of character. A week later, Richard made a decision that surprised everyone. He announced he was retiring from his position as company president to spend more time with his family. "Dad, you don't have to do this," Brian protested. "Yes, I do. I missed the first 6 months of my grandson's life because I was always too busy. I won't miss anything else. And the company? You'll take over, if you want. But this time, we'll do things differently. We'll have a real family business, where family comes first." Brian looked at Jennifer, who smiled encouragingly. "I accept, Dad, but on one condition." "What?" "We'll create a support program for single mothers in honor of Grandma Eleanor and what Jennifer went through." Richard felt his eyes welling with tears. "Your grandmother would be proud." By the end of that week, Richard was in the garden with Ethan in his arms when Jennifer approached. "Richard, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why did you change so much? I mean, Brian told me you were always so focused on work, distant from the family." Richard looked down at Ethan, who was trying to grab a button on his shirt. "You know, Jennifer, I spent my whole life thinking success was about money, power, recognition. But when I saw you with Ethan that first night, I saw what really matters." "What did you see?" "Unconditional love. You were going through the hardest time, yet you still cared for him with such dedication. I realized I'd lost that along the way, the ability to love without expecting anything in return. And now? Now I know Ethan is my second chance. The chance to be the grandfather my father never could be for me. The chance to truly be present." Ethan chose that moment to smile at Richard, and he felt his heart fill with a happiness he'd never known before. "Jennifer, thank you." "For what?" "For bringing my grandson into my life, for giving me the chance to be a better person." "Richard, you were always a good person. You just needed to remember that." 2 months later, the house was filled with celebration. It was Ethan's first birthday, and Richard had made sure it would be unforgettable. The garden was decorated with colorful balloons and a table full of sweets and snacks. There weren't many guests, just family, Dorothy, and a few close friends of Brian and Jennifer. Ethan, now a year old, crawled around the garden under everyone's watchful eyes. He'd received so many gifts he didn't even know where to start playing. "Dad," Brian approached Richard, "thank you for everything." "For what?" "For accepting us, for giving Jennifer a chance, for being the grandfather Ethan deserves." Richard watched his grandson trying to eat a piece of cake with his hands, making a mess and laughing with joy. "Brian, can I confess something to you?" "Of course. This has been the happiest year of my life." "Even with all the problems?" "Especially because of them. The problems forced me to see what really matters." At that moment, Ethan lifted his little arms to Richard, asking to be held. When Richard picked him up, the baby planted a wet kiss on his cheek and said, "Grandpa." It was his first clear word, and it was Grandpa. Richard felt tears streaming down his face as he hugged his grandson. Around him, his family, finally whole, smiled and applauded. Margaret came over and touched Richard's arm. "Your mother would be so proud." "She would," Richard agreed, looking up at the sky. "So proud." The party lasted until nightfall. When all the guests had left, the family gathered in the living room. Ethan slept in Jennifer's arms, exhausted after such a busy day. "Richard," Jennifer said softly, "can I show you something?" She pulled an envelope from her bag. "What is it?" A letter I wrote for you months ago when I was living on the streets. I could never bring myself to send it. Richard opened the letter with curiosity. Dear Mr. Anderson, my name is Jennifer Miller, and I'm the mother of Ethan, your grandson. I know you may not want anything to do with us, but I had to try. Ethan is a beautiful, healthy baby. He has the dark eyes of the Anderson family and that little mark on his neck your mother said all the men in your family have. I'm not asking for money or any kind of help. I just wanted you to know you have an amazing grandson, and he'll be raised with so much love, even if it's just by me. If you ever want to meet him, I'll be here, because Ethan deserves to know his whole family. With respect, Jennifer. Richard finished reading the letter with tears in his eyes. Jennifer, why did you keep this? To remind myself never to give up hope. Even in the hardest moments, I believed one day Ethan would know his family. And you were right. You never gave up, and that's why we're all here today. Richard carefully folded the letter and tucked it into his pocket. I'll keep this forever, to remember the strength and determination you had. Brian stood and walked to the window. You know what? I think Grandma Eleanor was right all along. About what? Jennifer asked. She always said love finds a way to fix things, no matter how complicated they seem. Richard looked around the room. His family was together. Ethan slept peacefully, and for the first time in decades, he felt whole. Your grandmother was a wise woman, he said, and she was right. Love always finds a way. Outside, a gentle rain began to fall, but inside the house, everything was warmth and comfort. The Anderson family was finally complete, and Richard knew he'd never let anything come between him and the people he loved again. Ethan stirred in his sleep and murmured, "Grandpa," once more, making everyone smile. That simple word had changed everything in Richard's life, reminding him that sometimes the greatest treasures come in the smallest packages. 3 years had passed since that night when Richard came home to find Jennifer feeding Ethan in the living room. Now, at 4 years old, Ethan ran through the mansion's garden playing hide-and-seek with his grandfather. The company had become a model of social responsibility, with programs supporting mothers in vulnerable situations. Brian had become a respected leader, always prioritizing work-life balance. Jennifer had finished nursing school with the family's support and now worked at Hope Children's Hospital, which the company had helped renovate. Margaret, surprisingly, had become her closest friend and confidant. "Grandpa," Ethan shouted, running toward Richard. "Found you." Richard scooped him up and spun him around the garden. "Ethan, you're getting too good at this game." "That's because Grandma Margaret taught me where you always hide." Richard glanced at the porch where Margaret watched with a smile. Their relationship had completely transformed. She'd learned to value family over appearances, and he'd learned to forgive. "Ethan," Jennifer called from the kitchen. "Lunchtime." "Coming, Mom." Ethan wriggled out of Richard's arms and dashed inside. Richard lingered in the garden a moment longer, watching life unfold around him. His phone rang, a call from the company, probably some issue needing his attention. Richard looked at the screen for a moment, then silenced it without answering. A few years ago, that call would have been the most important thing in the world. Today, it could wait. Ethan was calling him to lunch, and there was nothing more important than that. Richard walked inside, where his family waited around the table. Ethan was chattering about the drawings he had made that morning. Jennifer was talking about her patients at the hospital. Brian discussed the company's new projects, and Margaret was organizing plans for the weekend. It was an ordinary, simple scene with nothing extraordinary about it, and that was exactly what made it perfect. Richard sat at the table and looked around. His life had been completely transformed by a homeless woman who had walked into his office carrying a baby. That moment, which had seemed like a problem, turned out to be the greatest blessing of his life. "Grandpa," Ethan said, tugging at his sleeve, "are you okay?" "I'm great, champ. Never been better." And it was true. Richard had discovered that there is no greater wealth than a united family, no greater success than seeing the people we love happy, and no greater fulfillment than knowing your life has made a difference in someone else's. Ethan went back to eating, telling a story about a little bird he had seen in the garden. Richard listened intently, committing every word to memory. because he had learned that it's these simple moments that build a truly rich life. And Richard Anderson, finally, was a truly rich man. The end of the story. And so, dear listeners, what lesson do we take from this story? Sometimes the biggest transformations in our lives come disguised as problems. Richard had his life completely changed because he chose to look beyond appearances and open his heart to love. And what about you? What stories of transformation do you have to share? Have you ever experienced moments when what seemed like a problem turned out to be a blessing? Share your experiences in the comments, we'd love to hear them. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more heartwarming stories like this one. Thank you so much for joining us.